Right, get ready, because this deep dive, well, let's just say it's going to be a wild ride. You've sent us some pretty diverse stuff. We've got Bernie Sanders speeches, a YouTube deep dive into Elon Musk's family history, and then there's this slideshow. Bold title, Make Our Oligarchy Great Again. So, yeah, we're tackling oligarchy.
It is interesting, though, isn't it, how these sources, I mean, they're all so different formats, different viewpoints, but they all kind of circle around the same idea of oligarchy. It seems like you're really interested in not just what oligarchy is, but like how it works, not just historically, but like right now in today's world, and maybe even like what it could mean for the future.
Yeah, exactly. We're not just going to define it. We're going deep. How do they grab power? How do they hold on to it? What are the dangers, especially, for democracies? And get this, we're going to be time traveling. Ancient Greece to modern day America, all to make sense of this whole oligarchy thing.
Well, a good place to start might be with Aristotle, way back in ancient Greece.
Yeah.
He had this whole system for understanding different forms of government, right? And he's the one who pinpointed oligarchy as rule by the wealthy few. Like, power is all concentrated in the hands of this elite group who are really just looking out for themselves. And it's fascinating how he separates that from aristocracy.
See, I always thought those words were like interchangeable: aristocracy, oligarchy. You're saying there's a real difference.
Oh, yeah. Huge difference.
Yeah.
To Aristotle, a true aristocracy, it's about the best, the most virtuous, the most capable people leading, and they're leading for the good of everyone. But oligarchy, it twists that idea. It's not just about being rich. It's about using that wealth to rig the system, to control information, to basically get what they want, even if it hurts the majority.
So it's less about noble leadership and more about a power grab disguised as like legitimate rule. That actually makes some of the stuff Bernie Sanders talks about hit a lot harder.
Sanders is definitely sounding the alarm, right? He's saying America's showing all these signs of becoming an oligarchy. Look at the insane wealth gap, the way billionaires can basically buy elections. He's arguing that all that concentrated wealth, it turns into concentrated power, and that's how democracies start to crumble.
Okay, so we've got Aristotle's ancient warning and Sanders' modern-day alarm bells. But where does Elon Musk and this PayPal mafia fit in?
That YouTube video you sent, it digs into Musk's family back in South Africa. His father made a fortune from mining during apartheid, and it raises some tough questions about where that wealth came from, the family's ties to the apartheid regime, all of that.
Yeah, and it's not a pretty picture of the mining conditions back then. And it even connects some of these same figures to movements today, political movements that seem to want policies that only help a very specific group of people.
It definitely makes you think, right, about how wealth and who, how that can shape what happens in politics, even across different countries and time periods.
And that ties back to what Sanders is saying about how the ultra-wealthy can basically write the rules to benefit themselves, even if it screws everyone else.
Exactly. And it kind of sets the stage for this slideshow you sent, Make Our Oligarchy Great Again. I mean, the title alone tells you they're coming at this from a whole other angle.
Talk about a bold statement, right? What's their main argument?
Well, they're basically saying American oligarchs, they should own it, embrace their position. They should actively work to get even richer and more influential globally. And get this, they actually suggest that formally switching to an oligarchy and eventually even a kleptocracy, that it would be like more efficient, better for America.
Hold on. Are they actually saying we should have policies that just funnel government money straight to the elite? It's like they took Aristotle's definition of oligarchy and turned it into a campaign platform.
Their logic is that these American oligarchs, they're the, quote, foremost in wealth and influence globally, end quote. So they can handle what society needs better than the government can. It's a stark contrast to Sanders, right? He's warning about democracy eroding, the dangers of unchecked power in the hands of a few. This clash of ideologies, it's where things get really interesting.
Okay, so we've got Aristotle's framework, we've got Sanders' worries about modern America, and then we've got this slideshow that seems to, celebrate oligarchy. But how do these systems actually stay in power? History is full of oligarchies, but they don't last forever, right?
Right, and that's where Aristotle's insights get really, really useful. He noticed that oligarchies, they tend to rig the laws to favor themselves. They make it hard for anyone else to get into political office. They control the important stuff, like the media, education. It's like they create this this impenetrable bubble of influence.
Didn't he also say something about oligarchs being like paranoid, like always afraid of losing control and going to extremes to protect their power?
He did, yeah. Aristotle pointed out that they would often disarm the people, rely on foreign soldiers for protection. They create this atmosphere of fear and distrust. And this brings us back to that YouTube video and the whole PayPal mafia thing. Some people argue that this group, with their shared background, their connections, they might be doing something similar, maybe more subtly, but within the tech world, even in politics.
Wait, are we saying those connections highlighted in that video, could that be like a modern example of what Aristotle was talking about centuries ago?
It's an interesting parallel, right? It shows how those dynamics of power and wealth, they can jump across generations, adapt to new situations. The players change, but the basic principles, they stay the same.
This is mind-blowing. We've gone from like ancient Greek philosophy to modern-day tech giants, and it's all connected. So if oligarchies are so good at holding on to power, why don't they last forever?
That's the paradox. Aristotle actually said oligarchies are inherently unstable. They're prone to collapsing. He thought it was built into their nature, putting their own interests ahead of the common good. It creates conflict, resentment among the people, and that's ultimately brings them down.
So they're like planting the seeds of their own destruction. But then why do we keep seeing them pop up throughout history? Have they figured out ways to adapt, to survive?
That's the question, right? It's puzzled people for ages. Some say oligarchies can evolve, find new ways to stay on top, even as societies change. Others say they just morph into new forms of inequality. Like instead of overt political control, they switch to more subtle ways of dominating economically and socially. Think about globalization, technology, the way wealth keeps getting concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people. These are all things that could help oligarchic tendencies come back even stronger.
And that's where that "make our oligarchy great again" slideshow gets even weirder. It's almost like they're predicting this evolution, right? They want a system that makes oligarchic rule official, like built into the way things work.
It's a chilling thought, but yeah, they seem to believe that by just openly admitting it's an oligarchy and setting up clear ways to transfer wealth to the elite, they can make the system more stable and efficient. Of course, this brings up huge ethical and political questions, right? Like, what does democracy even mean? How should power be distributed in a society?
Yeah, absolutely. It makes you question some pretty fundamental stuff about fairness, about representation, about the common good.
Yeah.
But let's bring it back to our listener, the person listening right now. They're probably thinking, okay, but am I seeing any of this oligarchy stuff in my own life, in my own country? And if so, like, what are the warning signs?
Well, Aristotle actually gave us some pretty good clues on that front. He said to watch out for things like laws and policies that mostly benefit the rich, limited access to political office, power concentrated in the hands of a small group. These are all trends we can see and study in societies today. I mean, think about the influence of lobbyists, how much it costs to run for office, the way people go back and forth between government jobs and corporate jobs.
It's like those in power, they create a system where it's almost impossible for anyone outside their circle to gain influence or challenge them.
Right. And that's where social mobility becomes really important. If there aren't real opportunities to get ahead, if your wealth determines your entire social status, you end up with these rigid class divisions, which is exactly what Aristotle linked to oligarchy. And this impacts everything: education, healthcare, even access to justice. It affects the whole fabric of a society.
So if we are seeing these signs, what can we do about it? Do we just sit back and watch history repeat itself, or is there a way to fight back against these tendencies, to protect democracy?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one we need to think about really carefully. It's not about pointing fingers or blaming people. It's about critical thinking, questioning what we take for granted, and holding those in power accountable. It's about understanding that we all have a role to play in shaping the future. This deep dive, it's just the beginning. It's a call to action to really look at the world around us and ask ourselves what we can do to create a fairer and more just society.
Well said. This conversation has given us a lot to think about, to chew on. We've got the historical background. We've unpacked some pretty alarming arguments. We've even tapped into some ancient Greek wisdom, but we're not done yet. There's one big piece missing.
Yeah.
Technology. What about the role technology plays in all of this?
Ah, yes, the elephant in the room, or maybe we should say the algorithm in the machine. Technology, it can be incredibly powerful, right? It can be a tool for good, for empowering people, but it can also be a weapon used for control. It can make existing inequalities worse or even create new ones. It all depends on how it's developed, how it's used.
And we're already seeing that happening, right? I mean, think about social media, how it can be used to spread lies, to manipulate people, to silence dissent, or how algorithms can reinforce biases, leading to discrimination in housing, jobs, even the criminal justice system.
And then you have the whole issue of data privacy, surveillance. The more we live our lives online, the more our personal information is out there, and the more potential there is for misuse by governments, by corporations. It's a big concern.
It's like technology is adding a whole new layer to this whole discussion of oligarchy. It's not just about controlling the traditional levers of power anymore. It's about controlling information, controlling the narrative, influencing how people behave on a massive scale.
Exactly. We have to be aware of the risks, the potential downsides, and work to make sure that technology is being used to benefit everyone, not just a select few. That means thinking about ethical frameworks, regulations, and maybe most importantly, changing how we as a society think about the role technology plays in our lives.
I completely agree. It's not about demonizing technology. It's about understanding its power and using it responsibly. And speaking of history repeating itself, didn't Aristotle have some interesting things to say about how oligarchies fall from power? I seem to remember him saying that one of the key factors was the rise of populist leaders.
He did, yeah. He argued that these figures, often charismatic, great speakers, they would tap into the resentment and frustration of the people, promise to overthrow the existing power structure.
So even if their intentions were good, what Aristotle saw was that these populist movements often led to new forms of tyranny, or they just ended up replacing one set of elites with another. It's a cautionary tale, right? About how unchecked power, no matter who has it, is a dangerous thing. So if we're seeing signs of these oligarchic tendencies in our own societies, and if history tells us that these systems are prone to collapsing, what does that mean for the future? Are we heading towards a period of instability, of upheaval? Or can we learn from the past and find a way to deal with these challenges without going to extremes?
That's the big question, isn't it? I can't say for sure what will happen, but I do think it's important to be aware of the potential for disruption. We need to have honest conversations about how to deal with the root causes of inequality, of injustice.
So you're saying we need to be proactive, not just reacting to things as they happen, but actively trying to shape the future we want.
Absolutely. We need to be informed, engaged, and willing to challenge the status quo if we want to create a more just and equitable future for everyone. It's about understanding how power works, recognizing the patterns of history, and figuring out where we fit in this ongoing struggle for a better world.
Well said. I think this deep dive has given us a lot to think about. It's a complicated and challenging topic, but understanding oligarchy, it's essential if we want to protect democratic values and make sure everyone in society has a chance to thrive. But before we wrap up this part of the conversation, I want to make sure we're connecting all of this back to our listener. What are some key takeaways that you think they should walk away with? What's the so what of all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that oligarchy isn't just something from the history books or something that happens in other countries. It's a dynamic that we need to be aware of in our own societies, right here, right now. We need to be vigilant to guard against its corrosive effects. It's about recognizing the subtle ways power can be concentrated and used to benefit a few at the expense of the many.
And it's not just about being aware of the problem. It's about being willing to do something about it. We can't just sit on the sidelines. We need to be active participants in shaping the future we want to see.
Exactly. We need to ask ourselves, who's benefiting from the way things are now? Who's getting left behind? And what can we do to create a fairer, more just society?
I love that. It's not about pointing fingers or blaming. It's about looking critically at the structures of power and making sure they work for everyone, not just the privileged few.
Yeah.
But before we get too carried away with solutions, I think we need to dig a little deeper into the consequences of doing nothing. What happens if we let these oligarchic tendencies just keep growing, unchecked? What are the risks to our democratic institutions, to the very fabric of our society?
That's the crucial question, and it's one we'll explore in more detail in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at how oligarchies have declined throughout history, what factors lead to their downfall, and the potential consequences for societies that fail to address these challenges. It's a sobering topic, but one that's vital to understand if we want to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past.
Stay tuned, folks, because this deep dive is about to get even deeper.
So picking up where we left off, let's really dive into those consequences of inaction. Some of the sources you sent, they really highlight some potential risks. Remember that slideshow that was all about like embracing oligarchy? It paints a pretty unsettling picture of what a full-blown oligarchic society could look like.
Yeah, it wasn't exactly utopia, was it? It felt, I don't know, almost dystopian in some ways. What were some of the red flags that really jumped out at you?
One of the things that struck me the most was how little they cared about democratic principles. Like they basically argued that traditional democracy it's inefficient, that it gets in the way of the natural order where a select few are meant to rule. They even went so far as to suggest like dismantling the checks and balances we have in place. You know, the things that keep power from being too concentrated. Basically, they're arguing for a system where the elite are completely unaccountable to the people they're supposed to be governing.
It's a chilling thought, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
It almost feels like they're advocating for a return to feudalism or something, where power is just inherited and the masses have zero say in how they're ruled.
And they're not shy about the economic implications either. They straight up propose policies that would funnel even more wealth into the hands of the already wealthy, while at the same time they're talking about getting rid of social safety nets, you know, the programs that are supposed to help people who are struggling. Imagine a society where the gap between the rich and the poor is so massive that it creates like a permanent underclass, people who have like no chance of ever getting ahead.
That's the kind of scenario you see in dystopian novels, and it never ends well. But are there any real world examples that suggest this could actually happen? I mean, surely we have safeguards in place to prevent something like that from becoming a reality, right?
Well, history, unfortunately, is full of examples of societies that have fallen into those same traps of inequality and concentrated power. Think about the Roman Republic, right? Oh. It gradually transformed into an empire ruled by a tiny elite. Or the French monarchy, which, as we all know, led to a revolution and massive social upheaval. These are cautionary tales, reminders that even systems that seem really stable can collapse under the weight of their own contradictions.
So it's not just a hypothetical risk; it's a pattern that's been repeated throughout history. That's pretty sobering. But what about the argument that oligarchies can be more efficient? That slideshow made a big deal about how a small group of capable individuals could make better decisions than a large, messy democracy.
It's a tempting argument, I'll give them that, but it's really dangerous. I mean, who gets to decide who's capable? What are the criteria? History is littered with examples of self-proclaimed elites who thought they knew best, and it usually didn't end well. And let's not forget one of the most fundamental principles of democracy, the idea that all citizens should have a voice, that they should have a say in the decisions that affect their lives. Dismissing that as inefficient, it's a really slippery slope towards tyranny.
You know, it's funny how this conversation keeps coming back to Aristotle. He really seemed to have a deep understanding of human nature and how power works, even all those centuries ago.
He was definitely a keen observer of his time, and his insights are surprisingly relevant even today. Remember how he said that oligarchies are inherently unstable because they create resentment and discontent among the people? That's a truth that holds up across time. When you have a small group hoarding all the wealth and power, it's going to create tension, instability. It's just a matter of time before something breaks.
And that brings us to the potential for disruption, for upheaval. We've talked about the historical examples, but what about the modern world? Are there signs that we're heading towards a period of instability?
It's always tough to predict the future, but there are definitely some indicators that should give us pause. The widening wealth gap, the erosion of trust in institutions, the rise of political extremism, the way society is becoming more and more polarized. These are all warning signs, signals that something isn't right. And when you factor in things like rapid technological change and the disruptive effects of globalization, it creates a very complex and potentially volatile mix.
So it's not just one thing. It's a combination of factors that could create the conditions for instability. And if history is any guide, it's probably not going to be a peaceful or orderly process.
That's an important point. revolutions, uprisings, social unrest. These things rarely unfold in a predictable or controlled way. They tend to be chaotic, violent, unpredictable, with consequences that can ripple out for generations. It's not something to romanticize or take lightly.
Definitely not. But if we're talking about like worst case scenarios, what happens if an oligarchy actually succeeds in consolidating its power, in reshaping society according to its own vision? What would that world look like, and what would it mean for the average person?
That's a chilling question, and it's not one I like to dwell on. But let's just imagine for a moment that the elite actually managed to implement the policies they outlined in that slideshow. What we might end up with is a society that's incredibly stratified, with rigid class divisions, very little social mobility, and a concentration of wealth and power that's unlike anything we've seen in modern times.
It sounds like a recipe for social unrest, for widespread discontent. I mean, if you're constantly being told that you have no chance of improving your life, that the system is rigged against you, wouldn't that lead to resentment, anger, and eventually rebellion?
It's definitely a possibility, and we have plenty of historical examples of oppressed people rising up against their oppressors, even when the odds seem insurmountable. But the outcome of those uprisings, it's never certain. Sometimes they lead to positive change, but just as often they result in even greater tyranny, or they just end up replacing one set of elites with another. The French Revolution, for example, ultimately led to the rise of Napoleon, a new form of authoritarianism.
So even in the face of oppression, there's no guarantee of a happy ending. But what about the role of technology in all of this? We talked earlier about how it can be both empowering and controlling. Could technology be used to either like prop up an oligarchic system or to disrupt it?
That's a really interesting question, and it's one that's at the center of so many debates right now. On the one hand, technology can definitely be used to strengthen surveillance, to control information, to silence dissent. It can be a very powerful tool for authoritarian regimes. Think about how facial recognition technology, social media monitoring, internet censorship are being used in places like China. Those are all examples of how technology can be used to reinforce existing power structures.
But couldn't technology also be used to empower people, to promote transparency, to hold those in power accountable? I mean, we've seen that happen too with social movements, using social media to organize protests, to raise awareness, to challenge oppressive regimes.
Absolutely. Technology is a double-edged sword. The way it's used ultimately depends on who's wielding it and what their goals are. That's why it's so important to be aware of the potential downsides and to advocate for the responsible use of technology, the kind that promotes democratic values, protects individual rights, and serves the common good.
This whole conversation has been incredibly eye-opening, but I'll be honest, it's also left me feeling a bit overwhelmed. We've talked about the dangers of oligarchy, the potential for instability, the complicated role technology plays. It all feels so big, so daunting. What can one person do to make a difference in the face of such massive challenges?
I understand that feeling, believe me. It's easy to feel powerless when you're dealing with these kinds of issues. But it's important to remember that everyone has the power to make a difference, no matter how small it might seem. The first step is awareness. Educate yourself about the issues, understand how power works, and be critical of the information you're consuming.
So knowledge is power, as they say. But what about action? What are some concrete steps people can take to make their voices heard, to contribute to positive change?
There are so many ways to get involved. It really depends on what you're passionate about, what your skills are. You can support organizations that are fighting for democratic values, advocate for policies that address inequality, talk to your elected officials, use your voice to speak out against injustice.
Those are all great suggestions, but they also require a certain amount of time, of commitment. What about people who are already feeling overwhelmed just by daily life? Are there smaller, more everyday actions that can make a difference?
Yeah, absolutely. Even small actions can have a ripple effect. You can support local businesses, get involved in your community, be mindful of your consumption habits, choose to support companies and organizations that align with your values, and maybe most importantly, just be kind, be compassionate, be empathetic towards others. Building a more just and equitable society starts with individual actions, with a commitment to creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
That's a powerful message, and is one that gives me hope. We might not be able to solve all the world's problems overnight, but we can each do our part to make a positive impact. It's about recognizing that we're all connected, that our actions, no matter how small, can contribute to a larger movement for change.
And sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply refusing to give in to cynicism, to despair. Believe in the possibility of a better future and work towards it with hope, with determination, with a commitment to making the world a more just and equitable place for all. Remember that Margaret Mead quote. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.
That's a great quote. It reminds us that we're not alone in this. There are so many others who share our values, who are fighting for a better future, and together we can make a difference. Okay, so we've explored like the dark side, right? The
Yeah.
potential downsides, if these oligarchic tendencies, if we just let them run wild, and we even went there with some pretty bleak what if scenarios.
But I think it's really important to end on a more hopeful note. We've talked about the dangers, but knowledge, understanding these things, that's the first step towards actually doing something about it. And what I find really inspiring is that despite all the risks, Aristotle actually believed that oligarchies, they kind of have this built-in self-destruct button.
Wait, really? So they're sabotaging themselves somehow?
Yeah, in a way, it's their constant focus on their own interests, their need to hoard all the wealth and power. That's ultimately what creates the conditions for their own downfall. It breeds resentment, it leads to instability, and eventually it makes them vulnerable to collapse.
That's kind of a hopeful thought, actually. It's like they're building their own house of cards, just waiting for it all to come crashing down.
And history is full of examples of this happening, right? The fall of the Roman Republic, the French Revolution, the collapse of the Soviet Union. These were all systems that became so rigid, so top-heavy with power, that they eventually just buckled under their own weight.
So it's not just about waiting for them to self-destruct, right? We can we can speed up that process by pushing for change, by demanding more equitable systems, by holding those in power accountable.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we have agency. We're not just passive bystanders in all of this. We have a voice, we have a vote, and we have the power to shape the future we want.
So this isn't just like a doom and gloom prediction. It's a call to action, right? It's an invitation to get involved in building a better world.
Precisely. It's about recognizing our interconnectedness. Our actions, even the small ones, they can contribute to something bigger, to a movement for change. It's about finding our place in that movement and using whatever skills and talents we have to make a difference.
I love that. It's about taking back our power, our power as citizens, as individuals who have a right to demand a just and equitable society.
And it's about understanding that this isn't a one-time battle. It's an ongoing struggle, this push and pull between those who want to concentrate power and those who are striving for a more balanced and inclusive world.
So it's about staying vigilant, staying informed, staying engaged. It's about never giving up on the fight for a better future.
Well said. And I think that's a perfect note to end on. This deep dive, it's been a journey. We've looked at history, philosophy, we even touched on some dystopian fiction. But ultimately, it's a story about hope, about the human spirit, and about our ability together to create a world that reflects our highest ideals.
I couldn't agree more. We've explored some dark corners, but we've also found some glimmers of light. We've learned from the past, we've gained insights that can help us navigate the future, and most importantly, we've been reminded that we're not in this alone. We're part of a global community, people who are all working towards a more just and equitable world.
So let's keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those sources coming. The more we understand about the world, the better equipped we are to make it a better place.
Until next time, keep diving deep, stay curious, and remember, the future is ours to create.
And that's a wrap on this deep dive into oligarchy, past and present. We hope you found it insightful, empowering, and maybe even a little bit inspiring. Remember, knowledge is power, and the more we understand about power and wealth, the better equipped we are to create a more just and equitable society for everyone.